We are live. We can go ahead.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good morning and good afternoon to all. My name is Ping Hua. I'm an academic at the University of Southampton here in UK. As a volunteer, I have served the local Chinese community for over 20 years to combat racism, to support victims, and to promote Chinese arts and culture to wild communities. I'm the co-founder of the Chinese Association of Southampton and a member of No Cold War Britain. A warm welcome to you all to join this timely and important forum. This event is organized by the No Cold War International Campaign, the Qiao Collective, No Cold War Britain, and the Chinese Community Council of Australia. We have nearly 500 registrations from over 32 countries. We are extremely fortunate and delighted to have speakers today from Britain, the United States, Australia, India, and Canada. Sheila, Xiao, and I will be your hosts today. I'm chairing the first part of the meeting, and Sheila will take over for the second part. Please be kindly reminded that all speakers have 7 minutes, except for the keynote speech by Dr. Gerard Horne, which will be 50 minutes. The escalation of Cold War offensive led by US, and along with Britain, Canada, and Australia, which is leading to racism against those of Chinese heritage, regardless of their political views, and those who are not of Chinese heritage are being targeted if they speak out against the Cold War against China. According to recent YouGov poll into racism, people from Chinese background living in the UK are more exposed to racist comments than any other community in Britain. It found that some 60% of ethnic Chinese questioned said they have had experienced someone using a racial slur directed against them on at least one occasion. 60% said that it has happened to them multiple times, much higher than the average. Over the pandemic period, we have witnessed a spike in hate crime against the people of Asia heritage, especially those from the Far East, Southeast, and South Asia, as they were mistakenly targeted as Chinese. Our figures over the last year show a spike in racially motivated hate incidents of over 500%. The main trigger for this increase is a xenophobic statement, smear and anti-China propaganda by politicians and the media. Hate crime incidents, including verbal abuse, graffiti, threats while queuing for food at supermarket, physical assault on street, city center, school, and university campus, criminal damage to business, and arson and acid attacks, even murder. In 2018, the Trump administration launched a China initiative to reflect its strategic priority of countering Chinese national security threats and reinforce the president's overall national security strategy. Several American Chinese scientists were arrested and humiliated as Chinese spies without any evidence. Professor Chen Gang was one of them and said, before the China initiative, you were innocent until proven guilty. Now you are guilty until you prove you are innocent. Judy Chu, a California Democrat and the first Chinese American woman in US Congress told the US media in December that the Chinese initiative is an instrument for racial profiling. The government has turned it into a means of terrorize Chinese scientists and engineers. Something has gone dramatically wrong. Professor Chu Xiangguo, a famous Chinese biologist, and her husband, a Chinese biologist, were arrested in Canada in 2020, and were both fired from Canada's National Microbiology Laboratory last year without any explanation. Similar cases have happened in Australia, which will be covered by Dr. Antony Pan in his speech. Most recently, MI5 have warned about Christina Lee, a British Chinese solicitor, interfering in British parliamentary politics on behalf of China. No evidence have been presented to support the claim that Ms. Lee has engaged in illegal activity. No charges have been brought, nor have evidence been presented that she engaged in activity any different than those who attempt to promote good relations between Britain and the countries other than China. In reality, it represents an escalation of the witch hunt against a member of the Chinese community living and working in the UK, and the attempt to intimidate those seeking to promote good relations between Britain and China. The true aim of this so-called security alert has two components. First, to try to establish a double stand, which deems it's okay to promote a good relation between Britain and some countries, such as the US, France, Israel, but impermissible to promote good relationships between Britain and other countries, such as China. Second, to whip up apprehension, discriminatory attitudes, and the racism against the yellow peril of China. Now, with a great honor, I would like to introduce our first speaker. I'm not sure whether the Gerard Horne is here now. So we waiting our keynote speakers from Gerard Horne. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, the Dr. Antony Pan. Dr. Antony Pan was a chief medical scientist for over 20 years before moving to administrative law and served as a member of the Immigration Review Tribunal in 1975. Dr. Pan has worked for the Chinese community for over 30 years and is currently the national president of the Chinese Community Council of Australia, chairman of the Multicultural Community Council of NSW, and the president of the Australia Health Reform Association. Let's welcome Dr. Antony Pan.
Thank you, Dr. Pinghua. I didn't realize that I had the 7 minutes, so I have shortened the speech down to about that. So if you bear with me, I'll start right now. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the forum to allow me to speak about current Chinese-Australian predicament and start with the introduction to Australian geopolitics that leads to the new Cold War packaged by Australian politicians, constantly towing the US line by incessantly beating the war drums in South China Sea, the rejuvenating of McCarthyism and stimulating xenophobia in Australia. In December 2016 is the onset of a deteriorating relations between Australia and China, where former Premier of New South Wales and Foreign Minister Bob Carr coined the term China panic. Despite China being our #1 trading partner, the Australia-China relations became frozen when ministerial communications at that level ceased to exist. All the above events have an adverse bearing on the lifestyle and aspirations of 1.2 million Chinese Australians. Australia followed Trump's next move, a serious Chinese containment, starting with the call for freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, stirring up ASEAN nations of their territorial claims with China, and encouraged Taiwan's independence from China and selling arms to Taiwan. All the above leads to a new Cold War II and successfully created China as the new enemy, with a possible war with China in the background. All this only took a few short 4 years to dismantle all the good work done by former prime ministers of Australia and President Nixon, President Carter, and Henry Kissinger. While at home, we followed the American foreign policy with no regard to China being our #1 trading partner, or worry about the $20 billion lost already in trade so far. For our own part, Australian government introduced foreign interference bill and accused China of starting Cold War COVID-19 in Wuhan and joining the American narratives on Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. In Australia, following American policy does have drawbacks for Chinese Australians. For example, there is a rise of xenophobia activities as reported by the Australian Human Rights Commission, headed by Race Commissioner Mr. Chen Tan. The feelings and stress and trauma are well documented in our weekly commentaries. Chinese immigrants coming to settle in Australia, call Australia home, are from the global Chinese diaspora outside China, from China, and local Australian-born Chinese. They're all corporate suite regardless of the background and culture of the white Chinese diaspora. When racists attack, they don't ask you for your background before they proceed. Asians that look like Chinese also copied. Hence, the real pain felt by Chinese Australians is the questioning of their loyalty in public. That causes collateral damage and xenophobia going back, as a McCarthyistic mentality. A good example of McCarthyism is an incident involving the questioning of 3 Chinese Australian youth by Senator Alberts in a Senate hearing, which caused a lot of consternation in the Chinese Australian community and Australian-wide. While all these events stroll past the Australian stage, there appears to be no concerted Chinese Australian community voice expressing our feelings, except for a few brave ones in the Chinese Community Council of Australia and the National Chinese Australian Leadership Group, who spoke out on behalf of 1.2 million Chinese Australians. Those previously active in the Chinese Australian community were deadly silent because of the threat of being labeled red panda huggers, or scared of being accused of having associated with the bogeyman organizations from China called the United Front. The latest stress comes from politicians beating the war drums over South China Sea and possible war with Taiwan, and the realization that our sons and grandsons may be called up or sent to South China Sea for a war with China. Whether Chinese Australia would be happy for their descendants to go there in Australian uniform is unequivocally answered. It's simply, the simple answer is yes, because my country, right or wrong, is a principle that we hold dear to. The second fear of war with China is the possible internment of Chinese Australians. This happened to Germans and Italians in Australia during World War II. A khaki federal election is coming soon, and Sydney Morning Herald headlines point, Morrison supercharged his red under the bed election scare campaign. We responded, this article is bad news for Chinese Australian who would cop the rise in xenophobia and reinforces the narrative that Chinese Australians are red panda huggers or spies. Thank you, Mr. Morrison, for putting the Chinese Australians under the red bus. Politicians can be critical of the CP and the Chinese government, but they should disconnect their criticism by adding that Chinese Australians are loyal to Australia. Recently, Jenny Leong, a New South Wales MP, stood up bravely in New South Wales Parliament and defended the Chinese community. Our publication, The Voice of Chinese Australians, is produced every week. And we have a disclaimer, which is very important, that we declare we are independent voice of Chinese Australians with no affiliation with CPC or Chinese government agencies. We are loyal to Australia, and we call Australia home. As Chinese descent, we have a natural empathy for Chinese people everywhere in the world. We promote no Cold War, no hot war, no McCarthyism, but anti-racism and anti-witch hunt. Finally, we promote global peace and against any war, and also promote global prosperity for all nations. Thank you for your time. That's it.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. Yeah, we are so glad to have you on board. And now our next speaker is Amanda Yi. So Amanda Yi is best known as a broadcaster from the US on politics, culture, and media criticism. Amongst her best known podcasters are Tackling Anti-China Propaganda. She is also the host of the podcast Radio Free Amanda. Welcome, Amanda.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Hello, Gerald Horne here.
Hello. Amanda, then we can have a Gerard.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. It's an honor for me to speak on this important panel with you all. Thank you to Fiona of No Cold War and Charles from Qiao Collective for extending the invitation. This month, March 2022, marks the 2-year anniversary of living under the COVID-19 pandemic for those of us living in the United States. This means that for 2 years, we've not only been living with this pandemic, we've been living with this escalated propaganda assault against China that's come with it. The propaganda assault is about to get even worse. In early February, the House passed the America Competes Act, which contains a clause that would allocate $500 million to the US Agency for Global Media, the media service behind Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, to spread even more news coverage critical of China. These news agencies are part of a media environment already saturated by corporate outlets whose primary sources for their articles come from defense contractor-funded think tanks like the Atlantic Council, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the Hudson Institute, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies, among others. We're also about to commemorate another anniversary. Next week, March 16th, marks the 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings, in which a 21-year-old man went on a shooting spree in Atlanta across 3 different massage parlors and killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. Right now, I'm joining you all from New York City, where we are experiencing an unspoken crisis of brutal assaults on people of Asian descent. In the latest of these attacks, just last Tuesday, a 29-year-old Asian man was attacked with a hammer on a subway platform. In April of 2021, a 61-year-old Chinese immigrant named Yao Pan Ma was collecting cans when he was attacked from behind, knocked to the ground, and then repeatedly kicked in the head. He then spent the next 8 months in the hospital and eventually died of his injuries on December 31st. Women and the elderly have been especially vulnerable. A couple of weeks ago, a 28-year-old was arrested for perpetrating a string of attacks on 7 different Asian women. In each of these assaults, there was no prior interaction. He just walked up to each one without provocation and punched them in the face. In January, a 40-year-old Asian woman named Michelle Go was shoved onto the subway tracks in front of an oncoming train. In November, 61-year-old Gu Yingma was sweeping her sidewalk in Queens when a man, completely unprovoked, violently attacked her, beating the side of her head with a rock. She died from her injuries earlier this month. Just a few weeks ago, a 35-year-old Korean-American woman named Christina Yuna Lee was murdered in her Chinatown apartment. She had taken a taxi home late at night, 3 or 4 in the morning, and a man followed her into her building, up the stairs, and into her apartment, where he sexually assaulted her and stabbed her over 40 times. These are just a few recent incidents in New York City alone. There are so many more just in New York City, but there's not enough time for me to recount every one. And these are acts of racist and gendered violence, but there's a resistance among Americans to even admit that. After the Atlanta shootings, both cops and the shooter denied race was a motivating factor, instead claiming he had a sex addiction and just wanted to eliminate temptation. There's a reason the shooter targeted Asian women specifically, just like there's a reason Christina Yuna Lee was targeted, and there's a reason why on the subway platform, the man who pushed Michelle Go onto the tracks ran past everyone else and chose to target her. People also seem to be in denial that this propaganda war against China is fueling these attacks on Asian people. They argue there's no evidence that this escalating anti-China media coverage led to, for example, the brutal murder of Christina Yuna Lee. They seem to think that when we argue for that being the case, we're arguing that a direct link exists, like Christina's murderer read a Washington Post article or Atlantic Council report on the rise of China, and that's what led him to kill her. This is obviously not what we're saying. The link is not that direct. What we mean is this kind of anti-China new Cold War coverage contributes to an existing atmosphere where Chinese and Asian people have historically been dehumanized in the Western imagination, making them more vulnerable to violent attacks. Domestically, this perception of Chinese people is as old as Chinese immigration to the States itself. Chinese people in Chinatown have always raised the specter of uncleanliness and outbreak in Americans' minds. Since the earliest days of Chinese migration to the States, Americans always saw disease as something Chinese spaces incubate and that Chinese people spread. During the 19th century, Chinese laborers came to the US to dig for gold and build railroads. This importation of cheap labor was the basis for anti-Chinese sentiment among white workers, who viewed Chinese laborers as competitors in the search for work. And like how Chinese people have been blamed for COVID today, these Chinese workers were believed to carry diseases like smallpox, cholera, the bubonic plague, and blamed for disease outbreaks because they were forced to live in poverty conditions due to neglect on the part of the city. These public health outbreaks that were blamed on Chinese workers led to restrictive immigration legislation, like, of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited the immigration of all Chinese laborers for decades. And of course, you cannot divorce racism here from US policy abroad and its history in East Asia. This new Cold War is the latest manifestation of this imperialist history and the US desire for total military dominance in the Asia Pacific. During the Korean War, the US dropped 635,000 tons of bombs over the Korean Peninsula. They completely leveled it. And between 1965 and 1975, the US dropped more than 7.5 million tons of bombs over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, double the amount dropped on Europe and Asia during World War II. And from 1964 to 1973, the US dropped 2 million tons of bombs over Laos alone, making it the most heavily bombed country in history. You have to dehumanize people first in order to kill them so recklessly. And you can draw a direct link from Western imperialism to the popular image of the fetishized, submissive, hypersexualized Asian woman. These wars in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia destroyed entire villages and cities, destroyed economies, killed family members, and forced the women in these countries into a sex trade industry serving American military soldiers. And this is the basis of our popular perception of Asian women. Imperialism has made the image of the Asian woman to serve its own needs. Submissive and hardworking, often hypersexualized, whose own life is cheap and disposable. This makes us prime targets for street violence. Our labor is cheap, it's always devalued. Entire industries are built on this tacit assumption of Asian women's disposability and devaluation, from the military sex industry to the sweatshop garment industry to the domestic care industry. All of these industries, which are often rife with abuse and exploitation, rely on a largely Asian woman workforce. And just like the US policies of its war on terror made Arab Americans here vulnerable to racist attacks, the escalation of the new Cold War on China is directly related to the sharp rise in anti-Asian assaults we've seen. We cannot expect racist propaganda for imperialist posturing to not have an effect on Asian American lives. We cannot expect a continuation of the American tradition of the dehumanizing of Asian women will not lead to an attack on us. We cannot expect simply because the US is targeting China, racists will know or care about the distinction and not target other Asian people. An attack against Asian people abroad is an attack against people of Asian descent at home. Our response should be clear and simple: no Cold War on China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for sharing the horrific experience by the racially attack victims. So the solidarity that we need and get our voice heard. We need to unite together and get our voice heard. Thank you very much. Now, with a great honor and a privilege, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Gerard Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne is well known as one of the most outstanding analysts of a previous wave of witch hunt in the US and the West, McCarthyism in the US. He is a chair of history and African American studies at the University of Houston in the United States. His book, including The Color of a Fascist, Lawrence Dennis, Racial Passing and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism in the United States, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of the Slaves, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and the Capitalism and in the long 16th century, White Supremacy, Confront, US Imperialism and Anti-Communism, vast the liberation of Southern Africa from Ruders to Mandela, and many others. Let's welcome Dr. Gerard Horne.
First of all, it's an honor to be with you today. Thank you for inviting me. The question is, what was the role of racism during the unlamented era of McCarthyism and the Red Scare during the 1950s? It was essential and complicated. It was essential insofar as many of the most stalwart opponents of US apartheid and imperialism were those of African descent. I speak of Paul Robeson in the first place, the tallest tree in our forest, the multilingual socialist actor singer. Robeson's opposition to the Red Scare was stalwart in that about 75 years ago, he, along with the group known as the Civil Rights Congress, filed a petition with the United Nations charging Washington with massive human rights violations against Black people. That led directly to the United States snatching his passport, trapping him in the United States, and conspiring to ensure that his income fell precipitously from the high six figures to the low four figures. I speak also of W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the major anti-racist organization, speaking of the NAACP, a founder of an anti-colonial Pan-African movement, who also about 75 years ago, when he was 83 years old, was handcuffed and tried criminally as an agent of a foreign power, speaking of the Soviet Union, because of his advocacy against nuclear weapons. The Red Scare not only had clear racist and anti-communist elements, it also had sexist and anti-immigrant aspects. This is seen in the persecution of Claudia Jones, a leader of the US Communist Party, born in Trinidad in the Caribbean, who was tried criminally, then deported. She wound up in London, where she became a leader of the emerging Black community there, helping to found the newspaper, the West Indian Gazette, for example. This is also seen in the persecution of Jamaica-born Ferdinand Smith, who rose to become a leader of the main sailors union, the National Maritime Union, which he helped to found, a union which had a stranglehold on imports and exports to the United States and North America generally. He too was deported about 75 years ago. It was not just that prominent Black left-wing leaders were persecuted, handcuffed, deported. Organizations of the left too were forced into liquidation. This lengthy list included Robeson Civil Rights Congress, a major political defense organization forced into liquidation by the US authorities in 1956. This list included the Council on African Affairs, which specialized in anti-colonial and anti-apartheid activism and was led by Du Bois and Robeson, forced into liquidation by 1956. Ferdinand Smith's union, along with other left-leaning unions, were forced to the right. With the left under siege, the US ruling class simultaneously executed anti-Jim Crow or anti-racist concessions, moving the nation away from rigid apartheid. This was designed to improve its global image and allow Washington to more effectively propagandize against socialism and woo forces in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, all of whom were outraged by US apartheid. With the left under siege, US imperialism was then well placed to unleash attempted destabilization of Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, the Cuban Revolution post-1959, intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1965, genocidal war in Indochina, especially Vietnam during that same era, intervention in Afghanistan in the 1970s, alignment with apartheid South Africa during the same time, which involved alignment with the colonial powers that were members of the anti-Soviet alliance known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, especially Portugal, the colonial occupier then of Mozambique and Angola, amongst other sites in Africa. Simultaneously, left-leaning groups that arose to fill the vacuum filled by the erosion of influence of Robeson, Du Bois, Jones, and Smith were also subjected to murderous persecution. For example, it was in 1966 that the Black Panther Party was organized by African-American youth in California, in part to address the still festering matter of police violence, which of late has led to the organizing of Black Lives Matter and was reflected in the killing on tape of George Floyd in Minnesota in May 2020. Soon, a reign of terror was unleashed against the Panthers, with many of their leaders driven into exile in Cuba and Algeria, imprisoned or murdered in their beds, the topic of the recent Hollywood blockbuster movie, Judas and the Black Messiah. At the same time, with the Black left on the run, remaining Black organizations were easier to co-opt and compelled to either ignore imperialism's depredations abroad or support them. This remains a structural weakness of US politics insofar as the Black community, most of whom are the descendants of an enslaved population, continues to engage in class struggle domestically, but is handicapped in doing the same globally, which helps to shed light on the recent US foreign policy debacles in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan, amongst other hotspots. Today, we are facing a new Cold War. Indeed, since February 24th, 2022, an influential school of thought has emerged that part of US strategy going forward is not only deepening the vassal status of the European Union, which according to the recent memoir by John Bolton, SAC National Security Advisor under Donald Trump, a sector of the US ruling class sees the European Union as second only to China as a threat to US hegemony. And that rather than confronting China directly, the United States intends, per the recent comments of Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, to further sanctions against Beijing unless it accepts US sanctions against Moscow. A similar fate may befall India and other nations that refuse to go along with Washington's agenda. This scheme may become more feasible with the recent election of President Yoon in Seoul, South Korea, which can now join the anti-Beijing crusade. Again, As in the period 75 years ago, the Red Scare of today is accompanied by racism. It is not only the racism embedded in the war against migrants and refugees from Mexico and Central America and Haiti, there is also a pestiferous form of racism against those of Asian descent. This is nothing new. There was the instructive Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which kept to bar these migrants from California in particular, and betrayed a toxic fear of competition and hatred of them besides. This anti-Asian bias skyrocketed post-1941 with the war between Japan and the United States, which not only led to mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, irrespective of whether or not they supported Tokyo, but alas, the Euro-American majority often persecuted Korean and Chinese migrants, even though most were anti-Tokyo and pro-US, but they were persecuted simply because of the way they look. Something similar occurred after the attack on New York and Washington in September 2001, when there was not only persecution of Muslims and Arabs, but even Sikhs with roots in South Asia, but who wore turbans or headgear seen as markers of difference. Today, attacks on those of Chinese ancestry are accelerating, including mass shootings in Atlanta, pushing women into subway tracks in New York City, random assaults in San Francisco. Indeed, in this latter California city, police recorded 60 hate crimes against peoples of Asian descent in 2021, compared with 9 in 2020 and 8 in 2019. In Orange County, California, in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, hate crimes increased by 35% in 2020, the largest jump in at least a decade, with a 19-fold increase in attacks on Asian Americans, and with Black Americans as the most targeted group. Donald Trump did not help matters when he associated COVID-19 with China, referring to the, quote, Chinese flu, unquote. Indeed, the United States authorities reported 8,263 hate crimes across the United States in 2020, the most in 20 years. There has been a particular assault on scholars of Chinese ancestry, often accused of espionage. This is not just limited to the United States. Even the New York Times reported on the increase of anti-Chinese sentiment in Australia in the prelude to elections, with Prime Minister Scott Morrison accused of suggesting that Chinese Australians are an enemy within the gates, not unlike what befell Japanese Americans in the 1940s. What is to be done? The peace movement should see fighting racism internationally, especially in the United States, as a critical component of their mission, as racism is a critical component of the arsenal of the warmongers. This should involve international human rights investigations of the United States and their allies, for example, Australia, outreach to United States organizations on a bilateral basis, highlighting US racism in the press organ of your nations, and more. This is the path we must pursue if we are to ensure that the debacles that were inaugurated 75 years ago do not become the norm in the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much to Dr. Horne for your insightful, inspiration, and educational speech. You know, I think we learned quite a lot from you, and we are so fortunate to have you on this forum. Thank you. Now we are getting to a second part. I would like to invite Sheila Xiao to take over to chairing the second part. Sheila, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ping Hua, and also thank you so much, Dr. Gerald Horne, for speaking with us today. Before we move on to the next speaker, I did want to introduce myself. My name is Sheila Xiao, and I am a Chinese American born in San Francisco, born and raised in San Francisco, and now based in Los Angeles. I am the organizer and co-founder of Pivot to Peace, which is an organization of Chinese Americans and peace activists based in the US, urging for peace and cooperation between the US and China. Pivot to Peace, alongside the Answer Coalition, led the National Day of Action against anti-Asian violence, which took place in over 60 cities across the United States as a response to the racist murder of Asian women in Atlanta nearly 1 year ago today. That's why this conversation around racism, and especially war-driven racism, is so critical. And I'm super honored to kind of help lead the second half of this discussion. So with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Dolores Chu. Dolores is a fellow of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute Canada, one of Canada's research organizations on Canada's foreign policy. She is also a founding member of Montreal's South Asian Women's Community Center. She is a history and humanities instructor at the Marianapolis College and research associate at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute of Concordia University.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you, everybody, the organizers of this amazing panel and all the people who've come out to listen and participate. And you know, it is an honor and a privilege, but it's also great to be among kindred spirits and to share our varied experiences. So this morning, I'm talking to you from Jojaga, Montreal, which is unceded territory of the Gani and Gahaga, or the Mohawk people, who have been custodians of this land that has welcomed other indigenous nations and subsequently other peoples, including myself, who arrived here as a migrant from India a few decades ago. This afternoon, actually, at the end of this panel, I'll be heading off to a downtown location where we're going to be having our Women's Day march. And, you know, we'll be taking to the streets to, you know, shout out for justice, equality, peace, also against racism and hatred and violence. And so I'm sort of like, all these things are bubbling up in me as I join you this morning. You know, we have a large panel, and we're bringing our local experiences to this conversation. So some of what I say might be a kind of repetition, or maybe a local flavoring of similar things that have been shared or will be shared. So please bear with me. Okay. When we look at, you know, racism, the new Cold War, the new McCarthyism, witch hunts, etc., you know, when we look back in history, we can see constantly intersections of ideologies that seek to justify, to expand, etc., by deploying what I would call, you know, whatever the current flavor of the month is. So, you know, we can look at intersections of Western colonialist, imperialist objectives, and then how they deploy notions of weakness or inferiority versus strength and power. But when we come to the core of it, it's always about the economics and the politics. And in fact, what we're sharing today is about the economics and politics of racism. And I just got an alert. I'm sort of on an Encyclopedia Britannica alert, so I get these every day. So today, apparently, it is the anniversary of the Truman Doctrine, you know, that great anti-communist doctrine, 12th March, 1947. So speaking to you from these lands in North Turtle Island, you know, we have a long history here of colonialism and settler colonialism that has inherent to it race and racism, and also histories of enslavement and genocide. I mean, partly because of the kind of territory that Canada is, the kind of agriculture that could be done, the large scale use of enslaved labor from Africa was not possible, but there was slavery. So even as, people were kind of using the Underground Railroad and coming to Upper Canada or Lower Canada, there were enslaved people who were going in the other direction, right? So going back in history until today, we can see that these characteristics of colonialism and imperialism over here have been justified and condoned by notions of what I term Euro-Christian civilizational superiority. And in many ways, it's an earlier iteration of that notion of, the clash of civilizations. So over here, it was, civilization versus barbarism. And then there were doctrines that were trotted out, in the 15th and 16th centuries. The popes of the day basically said, these are terra nullius. These are lands that are not inhabited because they were not inhabited by Christians. They were inhabited by people who didn't have souls. And therefore, this is land for the taking. You can go and you can plant your flags. And of course, bringing in Euro-Christian, Western Euro-Christian notions of property that didn't exist in the same way over here. And then fast forwarding, we come to the end of the 19th century and the passage of that heinous racist piece of legislation, the Indian Act of 1856, which was designed to take the Indian out of the person, where Indians were not considered human and adults in a full capacity until they became white, right? So the genocidal policies of residential schools, putting people on reserves, restricting movement, denying political participation, and the list goes on. And that piece of legislation is still on the books. And then continuing on with the 19th and into the 20th century, with colonialism and semi-colonialism, and movements of people. So as we've heard earlier, workers coming from China to parts of Western Canada, the Western United States to build the railroad, to mine for gold, and also migrants coming from India, because at that time Canada was part of the sort of broader British Empire, and technically people were free to move within the empire. But then very quickly, we have attempts to curtail, to restrict. So the imposition of the head tax on people coming from China, which was raised continuously so that it became eventually like $500, it's a huge amount. And the Canadian government accumulated about $23 million, and eventually exclusion acts from 1923 to 1947, which had a drastic impact on, in this case, the Chinese population here, and a whole gender skewing, because a lot of women did not come. And similarly with migrants from India, the passage in 1914 of the continuous journey clause to restrict migrants coming from India at a time when the popular beer hall song was White Canada Forever. And those who did arrive, like people coming on the boat, the Komagata Maru in 1914, being dubbed Hindu terrorists. So we find this language, we've heard earlier of the Yellow Peril, always being deployed to raise a scare locally among people, but fitting larger agendas. So you have a subservient population that can be exploited for economic benefit. And of course, for other racialized populations that were already here, Jim Crow in the eastern provinces of Canada during World War I, when, there was first voluntary joining the Canadian Army, and then later on conscription, racialized people were not permitted to join. So African Canadians were not permitted to join, and the discourse among the military high command was that they're not manly enough to fight. Similarly with Japanese Canadians and Chinese Canadians, they actually had to leave British Columbia and come to the interior where they were not as well known. So this whole, also the gendered aspects of the racialization that feeds into kind of stereotyping. And in other respects, also the right to vote being denied, or the physical elimination. So a community in Nova Scotia, an old community of people of African origin, Africville, gets leveled to the ground when there's urban development. Similarly, in the place that I live, Georgia, Montreal, when a highway was being built into the city in the 1960s, a whole lot of Chinatown got demolished, and a community of African Canadians, Little Burgundy, got demolished because these were areas where real estate was cheap because racialized populations. And now there's a struggle to retain what little is left. And moving on into the 20th century, fascism versus communism, and we know these histories where fascists were tolerated and encouraged and seen as allies in the so-called threat of communism, right? Montreal was the place where Dr. Norman Bethune lived and worked, and some of you might be familiar with his history. He was a communist, he was an anti-fascist, he was in Spain, and then he was in Mao Zedong's Fifth Army. He died over there. But as a teacher, I always I'm not surprised that students do not know Norman Bethune. I have a lot of international students from China, and of course they know Norman Bethune because of Mao's essay in memory of Norman Bethune. And in fact, the only statue that we have in Montreal of Norman Bethune was donated to the city of Montreal by the people of China. And then we come to the start of the 21st century, 9/11, and heightened anti-Muslim racism, which in some ways was already in existence with the sort of, the demise of the Soviet Union, the death of communism was announced, and now you need another kind of enemy to rally the troops, literally and figuratively. 9/11 racism. And because of that, for 2 decades, and for example, Canadian intelligence have been on the watch for jihadists to the point where when a few weeks ago, the alt-right held, and people who were not necessarily alt-right, but who had grievances, so I want to put that out there, held the nation captive in Ottawa. And intelligence said, yeah, we've been looking for jihadists. We kind of escaped this. And those of us who are involved in anti-fascist work here have been saying that, you got to look at what is happening in your own backyard. And then the way this anti-Muslim racism plays out in terms of gender and racism. So the ban on the face covering, the niqab, and of course, now we're all being told you have to cover your faces with procedural masks. And in the province where I live, the passage of a law, which basically now bans, it says religious, ostentatious religious symbols, but essentially it's about Muslim women who wear the hijab, not being permitted to work in places of public employment and what are considered places of influence. So you can't be a public school teacher if you wear hijab. You cannot, of course, be a judge or a magistrate. So it curtails, it restricts the system of, a kind of apartheid. You stay isolated, you stay, economically deprived and marginalized. And of course, the creation then of the good Muslim versus the bad Muslim, right? Which we see again and again. And today with the war that is being played out there in Ukraine, we're kind of getting the sense of the deserving, innocent refugees. Many of us have been trying to sponsor Afghan refugees who have been languishing even before the Taliban take over, most recently in camps in Indonesia. And people are committing suicide in these camps, and we cannot bring them here. Whereas right now in Canada, you don't have to be deemed now a refugee if you are coming from Ukraine. And I sympathize with refugees who are fleeing all manner of injustice. So this is not the point I'm making, but is this the deserving and the undeserving, and peoples who are racialized, who look different, etc. This becomes a convenient way of exclusion, which is played to detrimental effects. In 2017, there was a massacre in a mosque in Quebec. Last summer, a Muslim family was murdered on the streets of London, Ontario. And And in India, we see, how anti-Muslim hate and racism, and there are, I don't want to go into the history of it, but right now it is an explicit political agenda of the BJP. And to some extent, we can say it is the same sort of deployment of racist attacks for political agendas, for developing voter bases, for support, for economic reasons. And of course, in Canada, since from 2018 to 2021, Ms. Meng Wanzhou was detained. And as has already been mentioned, with COVID, then we heard about the China virus, and the attacks against Asians are continuing here as well, including in Montreal and other parts of Canada. Elderly people are afraid to go out because of the attacks, right? So,
would you mind wrapping up just
yeah,
for...
I was just going to say, I've come to my conclusion. So I've been, listing a whole lot of things, but the whys and the wherefores, and then what can we do? So in my understanding, you have folk who are ideologically driven. We can't do anything with them. And then you have the opportunists who go here or there, wherever their bread is buttered, literally and figuratively. And then you have a population who doesn't know, who can be swayed. And this is the group that we work with. And the challenge is how to have conversations with this group. So thank you very much, and for your indulgence with my time.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Dolores, for your words. And of course, going through the historical thread of discrimination that pervades all victims of imperialist war. Next, we'd like to actually play a video and a message from Kevin Lee, who is a member of the Qiao Collective. For those who don't know what the Qiao Collective is a diaspora Chinese media collective that challenges US aggression on China. It is an all-volunteer group comprised of ethnic Chinese people living across multiple countries. The majority of its members are diaspora Chinese people living in the West. It is a diverse group including ethnic Chinese people from Southeast Asia, mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And it aims to challenge US aggression towards the People's Republic of China and to combat the stoking of new Cold War conflict with China. So with that, I think we're gonna play a video.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Kevin, and I am a member of Qiao Collective, a group of anti-imperialist Chinese diaspora living in the West. Today, I would like to talk about the history of academic exchange between the US and China. Like many of you, I'm deeply concerned about the increased scrutiny, prosecution, and detention of Chinese and Chinese American scholars in the West, especially in the US under the China Initiative. I believe it's important to have a grasp of how this wave of oppression fits into a broader history of US-China relations, as reflected by the technical and academic exchange between the two countries. The first Chinese students came to the US in the 1850s. The first Chinese graduate of an American university was a man named Young Wing. After graduating from Yale in 1852, he returned to China and to work for the Qing dynasty. He actually set up the first academic exchange program between the US and China, known as the Chinese Educational Mission, and this was in the 1870s. In this program, dozens of young men as young as 12 years old were sent to prestigious high schools and universities on the US East Coast to study technical fields like science, engineering, and management. This was so that they could bring back newfound technical skills back to China and accelerate the country's much needed modernization. Those graduates ended up a part of the vanguard leading China's early modernization efforts, and they produced several of the country's top academics, ambassadors, and politicians at the time. From this program, we see that the primary function of academic exchange now is to obtain knowledge and capital required to effectively modernize China. And the next wave of Chinese students in the US didn't arrive for several decades. During this time, Western imperialism continued to pillage China. It seized ports, land, and cities during the early 20th century. This led to Chinese peasants leading one of the first popular uprisings against foreign imperialist forces, known as the Boxer Uprising in the 1900s. However, their efforts were ultimately in vain, and the Qing dynasty ended up paying enormous reparations to Western powers. And interestingly enough, the Qing dynasty actually overpaid the US. The then ambassador to the US, himself a graduate of the Chinese educational mission, he negotiated with the US and to use the overpaid funds and establish a series of scholarships, as well as a university in China. The US president at the time was Teddy Roosevelt, and he agreed to establish scholarships as an attempt to reform China under American terms, to subdue China peacefully without military means. These were called Boxer Indemnity Scholarships and funded the next wave of Chinese students in the US. Of the many recipients of this scholarship, one of the most prominent examples is a man named Chen Schussen. He was educated at MIT and Caltech during the 1930s, and later on became a faculty member of Caltech as an engineer. But in 1949, after the Communist Party of China achieved victory after their civil war, he decided that he wanted to return to China and help rebuild the country. He faced really fierce opposition from the US government, who placed him under house arrest and forbade him from leaving the country. After several years, he was deported to China and ended up becoming the father of China's missile program. And so once more, we're seeing China and Chinese scientists reclaim Western academic capital and scientific capital, itself built upon and funded by the spoils of US imperialism. However, after the communists defeated the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War, China was no longer subservient to the interests of the United States, and therefore said reclamation of science and technology was deemed unacceptable by the US, thus leading us to the first wave of anti-China persecution under McCarthyism. The PRC wasn't recognized by the US for nearly 30 years, and that time there was very little academic exchange between the two countries. Once relations normalized, China began its reform and opening up period, and that started in 1978. Both governments heavily encouraged study abroad. Despite concerns over brain drain, China sent its next wave of Chinese students to study in the US. And these students, former students, and now many of them are seasoned faculty and actually face enormous pressure from the US. Because currently in China, there's a very strong push to reverse the brain drain that began in the 1970s and 80s. This comes in the form of friendly funding for returning scientists, pushes to high value industry. And as a result, we see that nearly 9 out of 10 Chinese students studying abroad in the US return to China, compared to only 2 out of 10 20 years ago. But the US responds by scrutinizing, sanctioning, and potentially detaining Chinese and Chinese American academics who are even suspected of participating in Chinese programs aimed at attracting returning talent. But when we look at modern history, we see this increased persecution not as an anomaly, but it's a part of a continued history of the US trying to dictate the development of China under its own terms. China is a country with a history of oppression under Western imperialist powers. It recognizes the importance of a strong scientific base and the importance of sovereignty when it comes to national development. Like many other policies aimed at containing China, the China Initiative was a reactionary, violent policy, which has utterly failed in its attempt at keeping American talent. Instead, all it's done is harm the well-being of thousands of Chinese and Chinese American scientists, as well as their loved ones. It cost them their jobs and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, not to mention the emotional trauma that will last years, if not decades. We must say no to new McCarthyism and say no to the new Cold War. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin and the Qiao Collective for that message and for going through the historical relationship between the US and China and just how far back McCarthyism goes, especially for Chinese people. So next we have Anna Chen. Anna is a writer, poet, and broadcaster based in Britain. She has written and presented programs for BBC Radio 4, and she was the first British Chinese writer and performer to take a show to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. She has been published in The Guardian, Morning Star, New Internationalist Magazine, Tribune, and South China Morning Post, and appeared as a commentator on BBC World Service and Sky News, and has been a strong opponent of the Cold War against China in Britain. Please welcome Anna. Oh, you're on mute.
That's a good idea. Thank you very much. And the speakers have all been wonderful today. This is making me feel a bit better about what's happening in the world. Today I wanted to talk about how racism is literally killing us, both conscious racism and the unconscious stuff that lurks unchallenged. For starters, none of the hideous cartoon-like villainy being pressed by the Western media could stick to Chinese so easily if it wasn't the product of centuries of demonization, ever since British narco-capitalists forced opium onto China nearly 200 years ago in the Opium Wars. So imperialism's modus operandi is always blame the victims for what you're doing to them. None of us should be playing into their hands, either directly or indirectly feeding the environment in which xenophobia thrives. That includes rendering us mute and invisible. Asian women have been designated bottom of the pile. If you're burying us in some sort of social media ghetto instead of giving us support, just please stop it, because solidarity has never been so vital, and we're going to need to love each other in this next period coming up, because it's going to be hard. So the objective of the United States and its allies is maintain hegemony in a unipolar world and do whatever it takes to crush, kill, or destroy China, the rising superpower. The first time I consciously realized what the end game to the project for America in the 21st century might be was in 2005, when George W. Bush stood in the wreckage of Iraq and declared China to be a competitor. I didn't realize at the time he'd actually said this earlier in his election campaign in 2000. So it's been a long time heating up. And yet, so China was supposed to be a competitor, but because China's goods were manufactured cheaply due to economies of scale and low-paid labor, it allowed Americans to live beyond their means and concealed the massive transfer of the national wealth to the rich through tax cuts by Reagan and subsequent presidents. This carried on unchallenged until the top 0.1% owns as much as the bottom 90%, and the top 0.0% owns over 11% of the national wealth. So America's ruling class has sucked its own country dry and left it with crumbling infrastructure, growing poverty, falling life expectancy, and a proliferation of tent cities in the richest country on the planet. And British, as we see, is rapidly catching up. Western capitalism brings us to the end of the post-war liberal order. It's clawing back all the advances we ever made, but they have two problems. One, how to claw back the advances made for ordinary Americans and Brits after World War II without the hollowed out working and middle classes comprehending this and organizing to stop the looting. And two, how to be a warring nation while playing the crusader hero in order to get the tax-paying public on board for conflict, as I've seen in several military think tanks. They say the silent part out loud. And in order to do that, to play crusader hero, you have to transfer the horror of all those years of US Axis wars and atrocities onto China, the upcoming superpower that's risen without any war since 1979. The Pentagon propaganda machine has made full use of racism and all those deeply embedded yellow peril tropes of the Fu Manchu supervillain in order to pin a blood libel onto the Chinese. And this, I see a lot of parallels with the 30s, and that playbook is in full use now. So you would know all of this if there'd been a grown-up political debate in the left press. I'm banned, actually. You may have noticed I'm not allowed to write on the subject of Chinese politics in the left media. There's been this absolute vacuum. And when you have a vacuum, of course, monsters tend to fill that space, because nothing is true unless a non-Chinese person says it is true. The West's plutocrats and oligarchs are now working on the shakedown of the upcoming superpower, which also happens to be our global growth engine and lifeboat. They're trying to get a new and improved opium wars II going. And you might recognize some of the same imperial powers on board who'd profited from Britain's carve-up of China in the 19th century, when Britain forced mass-produced opium onto the Chinese at gunpoint and turned an expensive aristocratic vice into a nationwide addiction. And of course, this is how they managed to take Hong Kong. When America's economic meltdown in 2008 threatened a worldwide depression, China actually saved the global economy from America's great crash by allowing global currencies to devalue against the yuan, taking a huge hit themselves. China bought up a ton of US debt, encouraged their own people to consume Western goods, and kickstarted the world economy back into life, stimulating the longest bull run ever. Yet the same people who made fortunes from China's actions now seek its destruction, because no good deed goes unpunished. It's precisely because China was so able and talented that America was terrified by the rescue, and not everyone will love you for saving your life. So great was the threat to ego and dominance that President Obama performed his notorious pivot to Asia 4 years later in 2012 and poured the military into the South China Sea region, or as the US likes to call it, the Western Pacific. They also renamed the watery bits around China and its environs as the Indo-Pacific, removing China's name completely. So now the US and its sidekick, the UK, are attempting to repeat the Opium Wars carve-up, this time using the ever so gallant defense of democracy as an excuse of war, instead of the heroin trade. Of course, British colonialists never practiced this democracy lark themselves, holding no elections in Hong Kong until the jig was up right at the end, which you all know if there'd been a halfway decent reporting in the mainstream or the left press, or any sort of debate during this march to war before the narratives set like concrete. And how can America actually be a true democracy if the oligarchs and plutocrats at the top own the politicians? Lawrence Ferlinghetti called out this aspect of the American political system in his poem, Bird with Two Right Wings. And I'll finish with this. I'll just do the start because it's fantastic. So a bird with two right wings. And now our government, a bird with two right wings, flies on from zone to zone while we go on having our little fun and games at each election as if it really mattered who the pilot is of Air Force One. And I recommend everybody reads that poem. I see my time is up, so thank you.
Thank you so much for reading us at least the beginning of that poem, and maybe you could drop a link to the poem in the chat so people can actually go and read it themselves. But thank you so much, Anna. I think it's really critical, what you said about just this vacuum of information on the issue of China and why it is actually quite critical that we are holding this webinar just to talk about the issue that really isn't being discussed anywhere in the mainstream. So next, I'd like to introduce Nick Estes. Nick is an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. He organizes with the Red Nation, an indigenous-led leftist organization committed to indigenous liberation. He is author of the book Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. He has made many contributions to speaking out against the US Cold War. Please welcome Nick.
Good morning, everyone. And thanks so much for the organizers for putting this together. I just want to give a brief overview of the new Cold War and sort of the geopolitical stakes, especially for Indigenous people. And first of all, I just want to talk about what settler colonialism is in North America and the Pacific, and how it might inform our understanding of this new Cold War, and specifically on what many of the speakers have talked about previously concerning anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism. So first and foremost, settler colonialism in North America, doesn't target Indigenous people, such as, my nation, the Lakota Nation, because of our religion or our spirituality or our culture. It's not based on the hatred of cultural difference so much as it's based on the fact that we stand in the way of land and resources. And so to undermine indigenous sovereignty, they make us into a race and they disappear us, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we should think about this in terms of the way that Asian people are racialized and surveilled, specifically in the North American settler colonial context, as well as in the Pacific context as well, that this is a struggle between the United States, as it has framed itself, in conflict with China. And we can see that in the current conjuncture of war in Ukraine, the way that the United States has ramped up rhetoric around securing so-called energy independence by advocating for the construction of oil pipelines and carbon infrastructure, which we know that targets indigenous lands and communities. And to put that into perspective, in Canada and the United States, although indigenous people make up a minority of the population, I think it's 5% in Canada and about 1 to 2% in the United States, indigenous-led struggles against carbon infrastructure accounts for contesting about 27% of the greenhouse gases from both Canada and the United States. So we make up a small percentage of the population, but yet we're challenging, about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions from Canada and the United States, two of the largest per capita, emitters. And so when we think about this in terms of the push for more carbon infrastructure and the development of oil and gas in the United States to fuel the US and NATO-backed, war in Ukraine, we can understand how that impacts indigenous people. But what's also important to remember is that prior to this, new push for oil and hydrocarbon frontiers, the Biden administration and the Trump administration were also pushing for green renewables. And before Trump left office, he declared a quote unquote national emergency for the US mining industry and signed an executive order seeking to curtail China's outsized control over the supply chain of rare earth and critical minerals. That order directed the Department of Interior, which is now headed by an indigenous woman, Deb Haaland, to quote, use its authorities under the Defense Production Act to fund mineral and processing that protects our national security. So Biden, comes into office in 2020 or 2021, and he has every intention to continue pressuring China on matters of trade and technology. And according to White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki, the administration would, quote unquote, be evaluating the tariffs imposed by Trump and is committed to, quote, stopping China's economic abuses, specifically in the realm of these rare earth and critical minerals. So why would the United States be focusing on this specific trade aspect with China? Well, according to the World Bank, 3 billion tons of metals and minerals like copper and lithium will be required by 2050 for wind, solar, and geothermal power to meet the base target of the Paris Agreement, which the Biden administration rejoined. And what does that mean for indigenous people? So on one hand, we had, the rightful kind of criticism of carbon extraction, right? And the creation of energy independence for the United States. And on the other hand, we have, the same kind of model, of extractive model, now being, deployed against China, but for the idea of creating green renewables at the expense of indigenous people. So in Arizona, where Biden won the native vote, the Forest Service could, in the coming years, hand over about 2,400 acres of an Apache sacred site to the Australian mining company Rio Tinto. In 2014, Arizona Republican Senator John McCain attached a rider to a defense authorization bill to allow the transfer of land to make way for a copper mine, which would create nearly a 2-mile wide open pit crater, destroying numerous native burial sites, ceremonial areas, and cultural items. And it's important to point out that Rio Tinto in Australia destroyed a 46,000-year-old indigenous sacred site to expand an iron ore mine in Australia. So as Biden promises a new green energy revolution, we remain staunchly opposed to his imperialist policies that not only are directed towards indigenous people, but are directed towards fomenting a Cold War with China. The United States has fought wars for oil, and now the government has turned towards securing what it calls strategic minerals, such as lithium, copper, and cobalt. And these materials are necessary for renewable energy and green technology. And to put that into more recent news, you know, at the leadership of indigenous water protectors, Kanaka Maoli people, at the Red Hill refueling station, naval refueling station in Hawaii, they had successfully shut down that site. I mean, there was they've been fighting, you know, the kind of pollution of this site specifically, and just recently secured an agreement with the federal government that it would be decommissioned. When it will be decommissioned is anyone's guess, but nonetheless, it's important to point out that a place like Hawaii, there are about 10% of their population is made up of military service people. And in a place like Oahu, military service people make up about 20% of real estate transactions. So in a place like Hawaii, which is colonized by the United States, we can see that militarism is in direct relation to how you know, settler colonialism and the replacement of indigenous peoples. But the Hawaiian site is also the kind of entry point of the United States, you know, Pacific Command in sort of containing and curtailing Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific area. So approximately about 375,000 US military and civilian personnel are assigned to what is known as the US Indo-Pacific Command, which consists of about 200 warships, 5 aircraft carrier and strike groups, 1,100 aircraft, and more than 130,000 soldiers and sailors, which also comprises, you know, that area comprises about 36 nations, which is home to about 50% of the world's population. And in this specific area, there's 5 of the 7 US collective defense treaties kind of entail the US Indo-Pacific Command. So when we think about anti-Chinese racism and anti-indigenous racism in the United States, there's strategic, you know, geopolitical interests that relate to this particular area and directly impact indigenous peoples. And that's also about half of the Earth's surface, right? So this isn't just, you know, you know, individually held racist views. This is, you know, this is going hand in hand with U.S. imperialism and the colonization of about half of the planet, right? I don't have so much time, but I just want to say, you know, the reason why it's important that they shut down this Red Hill refueling station is because the Red Hill site at Oahu was the refueling site for the RIMPAC, which is a strategic war games exercise that brings together about a handful of nations where they run war games in preparation for a war with China, right? And so this has been ongoing. And the Kanaka Maoli scholar and activist, late scholar and activist Haunaoika K. Trask said that the Haole, or the foreign war machine, including nuclear submarines and missiles, is well-oiled and ready for deployment on a moment's notice. Hawaii, like most of the Pacific, is a nuclearized paradise. And it's also important to point out that in the Pacific,